Pacific Ocean is not merely a body of water. It is a void. It is a blue desert covering 63 million square miles. A silence so profound that it swallows history whole. On July 2nd, 1937, that silence was briefly interrupted by the crackle of a radio carrier wave, a burst of frantic human speech, and then a permanent return to static. Welcome to the file. To understand the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, we must first strip away the romance of the era. Forget the ticker tape parades and the newsreel footage. We must place ourselves inside the aluminum shell of a Lockheed Electra 10E, suspended a few thousand feet above an endless, churning mirror. The time is 0000 Greenwich Civil Time. It is early morning. The location is the middle of nowhere. The Electra is a sophisticated machine for its time. A twin-engine monoplane shining silver against the dark water. But inside, it is loud. The twin Pratt and Whitney Wasp engines generate a deafening roar, a mechanical vibration that rattles the teeth and numbs the extremities. Earhart and Noonan have been flying for hours. They are exhausted. The cockpit is cramped, smelling of high-octane aviation fuel and sweat. They are chasing a speck of land called Howland Island, a flat sliver of coral and sand only 1.6 miles long and hardly wider than a landing strip. Finding Howland Island from the air in 1937 is not a matter of GPS coordinates or satellite uplinks. It is a matter of celestial mathematics and luck. Fred Noonan, the navigator, is relying on dead reckoning and sun sights, but the sun is rising directly in their faces, creating a blinding glare against the windshield. The shadows on the water are deceptive. Cloud shadows look like islands. Islands look like cloud shadows. Below them, the USCGC Itasca waits. The Coast Guard cutter is their lighthouse, their radio beacon, their only tether to the known world. The ship is anchored off the coast of Howland, its boilers puffing smoke to create a visual marker. But the smoke is thin, dispersing rapidly in the trade winds. Inside the radio room of the Itasca, the air is thick with humidity and tension. Radio man Leo Bellarts and his team are wearing heavy headsets, pressing the cups against their ears, straining to hear a ghost. The radio spectrum is a messy place. It is filled with the hiss of atmospheric interference, the pop of electrical storms hundreds of miles away, and the rhythmic washing sound of the ionosphere shifting. At 02:45, the first anomaly occurs. Earhart transmits. Her voice cuts through the static, but it is garbled. She says, cloudy and overcast. The signal is dark. In radio terms, this means it is strong enough to be heard, but lacks the clarity for the Itasca to lock onto it with their their direction-finding equipment. The tragedy of this moment is technical. The Itasca is listening on one frequency. Earhart is transmitting on another. Her plane, the Electra, had its trailing wire antenna removed before the flight to save weight. This modification, a decision made on the ground, has crippled her ability to hear the ship on certain frequencies. They are two people shouting into the dark, but they are standing in different rooms. Time dilates. The sun climbs higher. The fuel gauges in the Electra are trembling near the empty mark. At 0614, the Itasca receives another transmission. The signal strength is a 5, the highest rating. She is close. She must be close. But there is no visual contact. The horizon is empty. Earhart says, "We are about 200 miles out." She asks for a bearing. She whistles into the microphone. A sharp, piercing tone intended to give the Itasca a steady signal to lock onto. The radio men on the ship spin their dials, desperate to triangulate her position. They fail. The whistle is too short. The frequency is too high. The technology of 1937 hits its ceiling. The atmosphere aboard the Itasca shifts from professional concern to dread. They begin blasting black smoke from the funnels, hoping the dark plume will stand out against the blue sky. They fire the ship's boilers to the limit. They transmit on every available frequency. Morse code A for Amelia, over and over again. Dot dash, dot dash, dot dash. The silence from the plane becomes heavy. It is not just an absence of sound. It is a presence. It is the sound of the Pacific waiting. At 0742, the voice returns. It is shrill now. The professional veneer of the pilot is cracking. The physics of the situation are undeniable. The engines consume fuel at a fixed rate. The tanks hold a finite amount. The math is concluding. She says, "We must be on you, but cannot see you." But gas is running low. The transmission is loud. So loud that the operators on the Itasca believe she might be directly overhead. They run out to the deck, scanning the sky with binoculars. They see nothing but the glare of the sun and the flocks of terns and noddies circling the island. The birds are the only things flying. The terror of this moment is the proximity. To be so close to salvation, perhaps only 10 or 20 miles away, but blinded by the glare and deafened by the radio failure. They are trapped in a liminal space between arrival and oblivion. At 0758, Earhart speaks again. She says she is circling. She is trying to find them. The Itasca begs her to switch frequencies to 3105 kilocycles. They scream into the ether, pleading with her to send long dashes so they can find her. She cannot hear them, or if she can, she cannot comply. The disconnect is total. Finally, at 08:43 in the morning, the last confirmed transmission from Amelia Earhart washes over the receivers of the Itasca. This is the moment the history books record as the end. But for us, it is the beginning of the high strangeness. Her voice is described by the operators as frantic, breathless. She rushes the words. She says, "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilocycles. Wait." Then she says, "We are running on line north and south." Click. The carrier wave cuts out. The frequency goes dead. The line 157-337 refers to a line of position. It is a navigational concept, a straight line drawn on a map passing through Howland Island. Earhart believes she is somewhere on that line. She is flying back and forth along it, running north and south, searching for a speck of land in an ocean that covers 1/3 of the planet. The Itasca listens. They wait for the switch to 6210 kilocycles. They tune their receivers. Every man on the bridge is frozen. 1 minute passes. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing but the static of the Pacific, the hiss of the sun radiation hitting the atmosphere. However, the story does not end with silence. It ends with a cacophony. In the hours and days that followed the disappearance, the radio spectrum did not stay quiet. This is where the narrative shifts from a tragic crash to something more unsettling. Across the Pacific, and even as far away as the United States, shortwave radio enthusiasts and professional operators began to hear anomalies. These were not the clear, professional transmissions of a pilot. These were the sounds of a ghost machine. 3 days after the plane vanished, a housewife in Texas, scanning the shortwave bands, reported hearing a voice saying the word water repeatedly. A boy in Wyoming heard a jagged, interrupted signal that sounded like a woman fighting with a man. Pan-American Airways stations across the Pacific reported faint carrier waves on Earhart's frequency. The darkest of these reports came from a 16-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, named Betty Clank. On the afternoon of July 5th, days after the fuel should have run dry, she sat on the floor with her father's radio. She tuned it to the frequencies used by the Electra. For hours, she transcribed a nightmare. She wrote down phrases that made no sense at the time, but chill the blood today. She heard a woman's voice, tired and coherent, interspersed with a man's voice that was delirious and irrational. She wrote down currents. She wrote down water high. She wrote down that the man had sustained an injury to his head. The signal Betty Clank heard lasted for nearly 2 hours. It faded in and out with the tide. Official history tells us the plane crashed into the ocean at 0843 on July 2nd. The official report says the Electra sank immediately, dragging Earhart and Noonan down into the abyssal zone, 3 miles deep. But the radio waves tell a different story. They suggest that the Electra did not sink. They suggest it found land, not Howland Island, but somewhere else, somewhere desolate. The radio signals, known as the post-loss messages, imply that the battery of the Electra was still functioning. For the radio to work, the right engine had to be running to charge the generator. For the engine to run, the propeller had to be free of the water. This means they were on a reef. They were alive. They were waiting. The incident was not a sudden deletion. It was a slow, agonizing fade. The high strangeness of the Earhart disappearance lies in this window of time, the period where the world thought they were dead, but the airwaves were still vibrating with their desperate, dying telemetry. We are left with the image of the silver plane, perched precariously on a coral shelf in the middle of the greatest void on Earth. The tide is rising, the radio is fading, and the line of position, the 157-337, stretches out into eternity, pointing to a destination that no map has ever named. This was the incident, but the excavation of what happened next requires us to look deeper into the currents and onto the dry, sun-baked coral of an island that time forgot. Join me in part 2 as we analyze the physical evidence, the bones, and the artifacts of the castaways. Part 2, the context. To understand the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, we must first dismantle the romance of the era. We tend to view the 1930s through a lens of sepia-toned nostalgia, a time of courageous aviators and clear moral boundaries. But 1937 was not a time of clarity. It was a year of static. The world was standing on a precipice. The Great Depression had hollowed out the global economy, and the machinery of the Second World War was already warming up in the factories of Europe and Asia. Aviation, in this moment, was in a chaotic adolescence. It had moved past the wood-end canvas fragility of the First World War, but had not yet reached the pressurized, radar-guided reliability of the 1940s. Earhart and Noonan were flying into a technological gap. They were attempting to traverse the largest ocean on Earth using tools that were, by modern standards, little more than sophisticated guesswork. Let us examine the machine. The Lockheed Electra 10E was a masterpiece of aluminum and rivets, a twin-engine monoplane that promised speed and range. It was often called the Flying Laboratory, a branding effort by Purdue University, who funded the aircraft. But for this specific flight, the laboratory was stripped away. It was, in reality, a flying fuel tank. To make the flight from Lee, New Guinea, to Howland Island, a distance of over 2,500 miles. The Electra had to carry a staggering amount of gasoline. Extra tanks were installed in the fuselage. This is a detail often overlooked in casual retellings. These tanks were large, rectangular metal boxes that physically dominated the interior of the plane. They created a claustrophobic tunnel between the cockpit and the rear. Crucially, they blocked several of the cabin windows. This means that for the duration of the flight, Earhart and Noonan were encased in a metal tube reeking of high-octane fuel, with limited visibility of the horizon or the stars. The psychological toll of sitting inside a flying bomb for 20 hours cannot be overstated. Then there is the human element, specifically the man sitting behind Earhart. Fred Noonan is frequently reduced to a footnote, a passenger in Earhart's story. This is a grave disservice to the investigation. In 1937, Noonan was arguably the finest aerial navigator in the world. He had pioneered the routes across the Pacific for Pan American Airways. The China Clipper routes were his handiwork. He had transitioned the art of maritime navigation using sextants and stars on slow-moving ships to the high-speed, vibrating environment of an aircraft. However, Noonan was a man under pressure. There are whispers in the archival record, often amplified by sensationalists, about his struggle with alcoholism. While it is true Noonan had battled demons, evidence suggests he was sober and focused for this flight. The real issue was not the bottle, but fatigue. They had been flying for weeks. They had already crashed once in Hawaii during the first attempt at the world flight in March of 1937. That crash had been a violent ground loop that shredded the undercarriage of the Electra. The physical and mental exhaustion of two people operating at the limit of human endurance is a variable that cannot be calculated, but it must be weighed. But if we are to identify the true antagonist of this history, it is not the weather, nor pilot error, nor fatigue. It is the radio. The tragedy of the Earhart disappearance is fundamentally a tragedy of communication protocols. It is a story of incompatible technologies screaming into the void. To understand why they vanished, we must look at the modifications made to the Electra's radio systems. Earhart was using a Western electric transmitter capable of 50 watts of power. It was a decent system for overland flight, but for deep oceanic work, it was underpowered. Before leaving the United States, Earhart had removed a critical piece of equipment, the trailing wire antenna. This was a 250-foot length of copper wire that could be unspooled behind the plane in flight. It was essential for transmitting on 500 kilocycles, the international distress frequency, and for allowing ships to get a strong fix on her location. Why did she remove it? The prevailing theory is weight and simplicity. Earhart found the trailing wire cumbersome to use. She deemed it unnecessary. This decision, made in a hangar thousands of miles away from the crisis, effectively severed her lifeline. Without that long wire antenna, her ability to communicate on lower frequencies was crippled. She was restricted to higher frequencies, specifically 3,105 and 6,210 kilocycles. This brings us to the Coast Guard cutter Itasca. The Itasca was stationed off the coast of Howland Island, waiting to guide the Electra in. It was a clash of two different worlds. The Itasca was a ship. Its radio operators were accustomed to Morse code and low-frequency marine bands. Earhart was a pilot. She preferred voice transmission and high-frequency bands. The radio logs from that morning are a transcript of a slow-motion disaster. The radio operators on the Itasca could hear Earhart. Her voice pierced the static, growing louder, indicating she was drawing closer. But she could not hear them. The Electra was equipped with a new, experimental piece of direction-finding equipment called a Bendix loop antenna. It was mounted on top of the fuselage. The idea was that Earhart could turn the loop to find the null, or the direction from which a radio signal was strongest. But the Bendix loop had a fatal flaw in this specific configuration. It was not calibrated to pick up the high-frequency signals the Itasca was sending. Furthermore, the Itasca's direction-finding batteries were depleted, or at least the ship's ability to send a homing signal on the specific frequency Earhart requested was technically impossible with their setup. They were shouting at each other in different languages. Earhart was asking for a bearing on 3,105 kilocycles. The Itasca could not take a bearing on that frequency. The Itasca blasted smoke from its funnels to create a visual marker. But the sky was overcast with scattered clouds, and the glare of the rising sun on the water created a blinding mirror effect. We must also consider the location itself. Howland Island is not a tropical paradise. It is a flat, sandy sliver of coral, barely rising 20 feet above the ocean surface. It is 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide. In the vastness of the Pacific, looking for Howland Island is like looking for a specific grain of rice on a football field. While moving at 150 miles per hour, the decision to use Howland as a refueling stop was audacious. It was part of a larger geopolitical game. In 1937, the United States was anxious about Japanese expansion in the Pacific. The Japanese Empire controlled the Mandate Islands to the north and west. There were rumors, which persist to this day, that the Earhart flight was a cover for aerial espionage. While most serious historians dismiss the idea that she was a spy on an active mission, the government's support for her flight was undoubtedly tied to the desire to colonize and claim these uninhabited rocks before Japan did. In fact, the runway on Howland Island had been built specifically for her. A group of young Hawaiian men, known as the Hui Panelau, had been sent to the island to live in isolation, clearing the guano and coral to create a landing strip. They were there on the morning of July 2nd, 1937, watching the sky. They were the ground witnesses to the silence. The charts Noonan was using were also suspect. In 1937, the exact coordinates of many Pacific islands were based on maritime surveys from the 19th century. A discrepancy of 5 or 6 miles might not matter to a ship that can correct its course over hours. For an airplane low on fuel, 5 miles is the difference between a runway and a watery grave. There is evidence to suggest that the charted location of Howland Island was off by nearly 6 miles to the west. If Noonan navigated perfectly to the coordinates he had on paper, he would have arrived at an empty patch of ocean. The cultural context of the world flight added a layer of lethal urgency. Earhart was not just a pilot, she was a brand. She was deeply in debt. This flight was meant to be her swan song, the final major record before she retired to a life of lecturing and writing. She needed the publicity. She needed the success. Turning back was not a financial option. The pressure to succeed likely influenced the decision to take off from Lee despite imperfect weather reports and radio issues that had already plagued them in New Guinea. So we have the scene set. A plane that is a flying fuel tank, deaf to the specific frequencies of its rescue ship. A navigator who is brilliant but exhausted, working with maps that might be lying to him. A radio system that has been stripped of its most vital safety feature to save weight. A destination that is a microscopic speck in a hostile ocean, and a geopolitical tension that turned the Pacific into a zone of suspicion and silence. When we look at the disappearance not as a mystery, but as a system failure, the supernatural fog lifts, revealing something far more chilling. A mechanical and administrative inevitability. The tragedy was written before the wheels ever left the ground in Lee. The variables had aligned. The trap was set. But even with the trap set, the end was not immediate. The silence that followed was not the silence of instant death. It was the silence of a long, slow unraveling. And that is where the true horror of the digital archaeology begins. Because the radio waves did not stop when the official history says they did. In the days following the disappearance, as the Navy launched a massive search, radios across the Pacific began to crackle. House lights flickered with strange signals. Pan AM stations, amateur operators in the United States, and government listening posts picked up fragments. Some were hoaxes, some were static, but some were chillingly specific. This leads us to the post-loss radio signals, a controversial, often dismissed, yet deeply disturbing chapter of the story that suggests Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan did not crash into the sea and die instantly. It suggests they survived the landing, and for days they were calling for help while the world listened and did nothing. Part 3. The investigation. The silence that followed Amelia Earhart's final transmission on July 2nd, 1937, was not truly silent. It was a static-filled void, populated by ghosts, phantom signals, and the desperate projections of a world unwilling to let go. When the Lockheed Electra failed to arrive at Howland Island, the immediate response was kinetic. The United States Navy and Coast Guard launched what was, at the time, the most expensive and extensive air and sea search in history. The USS Itasca, already on station, began to quarter the ocean. They were soon joined by the battleship USS Colorado and the aircraft carrier USS Lexington. For 16 days, they scoured 250,000 square miles of open water. The cost was $4 million, a staggering sum in the Great Depression. Yet the official report was sterile and final. It concluded that the plane had exhausted its fuel and ditched into the sea. The wreckage, they presumed, sank immediately to the abyssal plain, hidden beneath thousands of feet of crushing pressure. This is the crash and sink theory. It is the most logically sound explanation, adhering to Occam's razor. If an aircraft runs out of gas over the ocean, gravity and hydrodynamics dictate the result. However, logic rarely satisfies the human need for closure, especially when the physical evidence, the corpus delicti, is missing. The investigation did not end with the Navy's departure. It simply migrated from the bridge of a battleship to the filing cabinets of bureaucrats, and eventually to the glowing monitors of digital archivists. To understand why this mystery persists, we must look at the anomalies that the official report dismissed. The primary anomaly concerns the post-loss radio messages. In the days following the disappearance, radio operators across the Pacific and as far away as the United States reported hearing distress calls on the Electra's frequencies. This is where the digital archaeology begins. We are not looking at mud and dirt, but at the propagation of radio waves through the ionosphere of 1937. Lockheed engineers later analyzed these reported signals. They determined that for the radio to work, the right engine had to be running to charge the batteries. If the engine was running, the plane could not be underwater. It had to be on land. Consider the notebook of Betty Clank. She was a 15-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, sitting in front of her family's shortwave radio. She transcribed what she heard in a composition notebook. She wrote down phrases like, "Water is knee-deep," and mentions of a man, presumably Noonan, acting irrationally due to a head injury. For decades, this was dismissed as the imagination of a teenager. But modern analysis of radio skips, the way signals bounce off the atmosphere, suggests it was technically possible for a signal from the Central Pacific to reach Florida on that specific harmonic. Betty's notebook remains a haunting piece of analog data, a transcript of a slow death that may have been overheard by the world. If the plane was on land, where was it? This leads us to the Gardner Island hypothesis, now known as Nicumaroro. This is the focal point of the modern investigation, spearheaded largely by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGHAR. Nicumaroro is a coral atoll roughly 350 nautical miles southeast of Howland Island. It is a harsh, unforgiving place, a ring of scrub brush surrounding a lagoon, populated by aggressive coconut crabs. The theory posits that Earhart and Noonan missed Howland, turned south on a navigational line of position, and landed on the reef at low tide. The physical evidence found on Nicumaroro is compelling, though circumstantial. Over several expeditions, investigators have recovered a piece of plexiglass that matches the thickness and curvature of the Electra's window. They found a size 9 cat's paw heel, dating to the 1930s, matching Earhart's footwear. They found a cosmetic jar consistent with a brand of freckle cream Earhart was known to use. But the most macabre piece of evidence involves a set of bones. In 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher found a partial human skeleton on the island, along with a sextant box and the remains of a shoe. The bones were sent to Fiji for analysis. A doctor named D.W. Hoodless examined them and concluded they belonged to a stocky male. The bones were subsequently lost, a common occurrence in the chaos of the encroaching Second World War. However, Hoodless left behind his measurements. Decades later, modern forensic anthropologists inputted those measurements into computer database programs like Fordisk. The results contradicted the 1940 analysis. The computer determined that the measurements were more consistent with a tall female of European descent than with a stocky male. The probability that the bones belonged to Amelia Earhart was calculated at 99%. This is the essence of cold case investigation in the information age. We cannot hold the bones, but we can analyze the data shadows they cast. We can look at the records of the tides in 1937 to see if the reef was dry enough to land a plane. We can analyze the degradation rates of aluminum in salt water. Yet, for every piece of evidence supporting Nicumaroro, there is a counterargument. Critics point out that the sextant box had a serial number belonging to a naval vessel, suggesting the bones could have been a castaway from a shipwreck, perhaps the Norwich City, which wrecked on the island years prior. The freckle cream jar is a common artifact from the era. The radio signals could have been hoaxes or misidentifications. Then there is the Japanese capture theory. This narrative suggests that Earhart and Noonan were blown off course, or perhaps were on a covert spy mission and landed in the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands. They were then taken prisoner and executed on Saipan. This theory has thrived on the internet, fueled by vague eyewitness accounts from locals who remembered seeing white prisoners. It appeals to the conspiratorial mindset. It turns a tragedy into a thriller. In 2017, this theory exploded due to a photograph discovered in the United States National Archives. The grainy black and white image showed a harbor in the Marshall Islands. On a dock, a figure with a haircut resembling Earhart's sits with their back to the camera. Near a railing, a tall, lanky man stands, resembling Fred Noonan. In the background, a barge appears to tow a large object roughly the size of the Electra. The History Channel aired a documentary claiming this was the smoking gun. Millions watched, but within days, the hive mind of the internet dismantled it. A Japanese military history blogger, acting as a digital archaeologist, scoured online archives of the Japanese National Diet Library. He found the exact same photograph in a travel guide published in 1935, 2 years before Earhart disappeared. This incident highlights the double-edged sword of digital investigation. The internet allows for the rapid dissemination of misinformation, but it also provides the crowdsourced tools to debunk it almost instantly. The photograph was not evidence of a cover-up. It was evidence of confirmation bias. Why then does the case remain officially unsolved? The answer lies in the vastness of the search area and the impermanence of physical objects. The Pacific Ocean is a dynamic, destructive environment. If the plane sank, it is corroding in the dark. If it landed on a reef, the tides and storms have long since shredded the aluminum and scattered it into the deep water off the shelf. In early 2024, a company called Deep Sea Vision released sonar imagery captured by an autonomous underwater vehicle at a depth of 16,000 feet, roughly 100 miles from Howland Island. The sonar painted a blurry, yellow shape against the black background. The contours resemble the unique twin-tail silhouette of a Lockheed Electra. Is this the plane? Or is it a geological formation? A trick of shadow and sound waves? The data is currently being analyzed. It sits on servers, a collection of pixels and coordinates waiting for verification, until a camera goes down there and reads a serial number. It remains just another ghost on the screen. The investigation has shifted from a physical hunt to a data processing challenge. We are sifting through the noise of history. We are rereading the police reports of the colonial officers. We are enhancing the audio of newsreels. We are modeling ocean currents. The failure to find Earhart is not a failure of effort. It is a testament to the sheer scale of the planet and the fragility of human technology. The digital footprint of this case is massive. Millions of words in forum threads, terabytes of sonar data, gigabytes of scanned documents. But the analog reality, the metal, the glass, the bone remains elusive. The theories act as a Rorschach test. The crash and sink theory appeals to the rationalist. The Nikimararo hypothesis appeals to the romantic tragedian. The idea of the castaway surviving against odds. The Japanese capture theory appeals to the cynic who distrusts the official narrative. We are left with a puzzle where the pieces have been eroded by 80 years of saltwater and speculation. The investigation continues not because we expect to save them, but because we cannot bear the idea that someone can simply vanish. In the digital age, we believe everything is recorded, tracked, and recoverable. Amelia Earhart reminds us that true deletion is still possible. The evidence is a collection of whispers, a shoe heel, a jar of cream, a line in a notebook, a shadow on a sonar screen. They are fragments of a life interrupted, debris caught in the orbit of a mystery that refuses to decay. As we move toward the final analysis, we must look beyond the mechanics of the crash. We must look at the legacy of the disappearance. What happens when a hero becomes a ghost? How does the unsolved nature of the case warp our memory of the woman herself? The search for Amelia Earhart is no longer just about finding a plane. It is about understanding why we are still looking. End of Part 3. Part 4. The aftermath. The frequency goes dead. The static rises. In the timeline of human events, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan is a microscopic glitch, a momentary lapse in data. Yet, in the cultural consciousness, it acts as a scar that refuses to fade. It is a wound in history that remains open, festering with speculation, romanticism, and the cold, hard reality of loss. When the Itasca ceased its transmission, the silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was the birth of a mythology. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of analog desperation. The United States Navy and Coast Guard launched what was, at the time, the most expensive and extensive search and rescue operation in history. Battleships combed the equatorial waters. Pilots strained their eyes against the blinding glare of the Pacific sun, looking for a speck of silver aluminum or the orange flare of a life raft. They found nothing but the indifference of the ocean This initial failure is where the narrative fractures. Had the Lockheed Electra simply run out of fuel and plummeted into the deep water, the story would be a tragedy, but a closed loop. It would be a mechanical failure, a mathematical error. But the absence of wreckage allowed the human mind to intervene. Where there is no data, we invent it. The legacy of this event is defined not by what was found, but by what was heard in the days following the disappearance. This is the realm of the post-loss radio signals. It is here that the story shifts from a clean aviation accident into something far more unsettling. Between July 2nd and July 18th, 1937, radio operators across the Pacific, and even as far away as the United States, reported hearing distress calls on the harmonic frequencies of the Electra. These were not clear transmissions. They were ghostly, erratic bursts of voice cutting through the atmospheric noise. Consider the notebook of Betty Clank, a 15-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, sitting on the floor of her family home, sketching in a notebook while listening to a shortwave radio. She transcribed what she heard for hours. Phrases like rising water, phrases like get the suitcase, mention of a severe head injury to the navigator. For decades, these logs were dismissed as hoaxes or misunderstandings. Yet modern analysis by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery suggests that many of these signals were credible. They paint a picture not of a crash at sea, but of a forced landing on a reef, followed by a slow, agonizing wait for a rescue that would never arrive. This turns the legacy of Earhart from a pioneer who died doing what she loved into a castaway, slowly perishing on the edge of the known world. This brings us to the site itself, Nicumarara, formerly known as Gardner Island. If you were to view this location on satellite imagery today, it appears as a sliver of land surrounding a brilliant turquoise lagoon. It looks like paradise, but to the digital archaeologist and to those who have walked its coral shingle, it is a liminal space of high hostility. The island is uninhabited today, reclaimed by nature. It is a place of aggressive heat, lacking fresh water, populated by coconut crabs the size of trash can lids. It is a biological machine designed to consume organic matter. The site is a corrupted archive. The physical evidence, if it ever existed, has been scattered by storms, bleached by the sun, and dragged into the burrows of crustaceans. In 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher found a campsite on the southeast corner of the island. He found the remains of a shoe. He found a sextant box, and he found a partial human skeleton. This is the most frustrating, unanswered question in the entire file. The bones were recovered. They were measured. And then, in the chaotic bureaucracy of the Pacific Theater during World War II, they were lost. They vanished into the archives of Fiji, misplaced in a box, buried in a foundation, or simply discarded. We are left only with the paper trail. Modern forensic anthropologists have run the 1940 measurements through computer models. The results indicate a high probability that the bones belonged to a female of European ancestry, roughly Earhart's height. But without the physical calcium, without the DNA, it remains a ghost of a statistic. It is data without a host. The media landscape surrounding the Earhart mystery today is a mixture of legitimate scientific inquiry and sensationalist noise. It exists in the subdirectories of the internet, on forums where users debate title charts from 1937 and analyze pixelated grains in photographs of the island shoreline. One specific image, taken by a British officer 3 months after the disappearance, shows a small, indistinct protrusion sticking out of the water on the edge of the reef. Intelligence analysts have enhanced this image thousands of times. Some see a rock, others see the landing gear of a Lockheed Electra caught on the coral days before the surf tore it apart and dragged it down the underwater shelf. This is the nature of the evidence today. It is indistinct. It is blurry. We are looking at shadows and trying to discern the shape of history. There have been millions of dollars spent on deep-sea sonar expeditions. Autonomous underwater vehicles create high-resolution maps of the ocean floor near Howland Island and Nicumararo. They glide through the eternal darkness, 6,000 meters down, scanning the silt. Every anomaly is flagged. Every rock that looks like an engine cowling generates a brief spark of hope before being reclassified as geology. The site is quiet. The radio waves have long since dissipated into space, traveling out past our solar system, carrying Amelia's voice into the cosmic void. The aluminum of the plane, if it is down there, is slowly corroding, turning into white oxide dust, merging with the seabed. What remains unanswered is the final moment. Did the radio work on the reef? Did she hear the Itasca calling her, unable to respond because her engine was dead and the battery was draining? Did she watch the tide rise, knowing that the plane, her only link to civilization, was about to be washed away? The legacy of Amelia Earhart is not just about a pilot who lost her way. It is about the terror of total isolation. It is the archetype of the vanishing. In our modern era of total surveillance, where every movement is tracked by GPS, and every silence is filled with digital noise, the idea of simply disappearing is alien. It is terrifying. It represents a loss of control. Earhart represents the last moment in history where the map had blank spaces. She flew into one of those blank spaces, and the map closed up behind her, we continue to search, not because we need to know where the plane is. We know where it is. It is in the Pacific. We search because we cannot accept the lack of closure. We demand a final chapter. We want to see the wreckage. We want to hold the artifact. We want to prove that the universe is orderly and that things do not simply cease to exist. But the ocean does not bargain with our desire for closure. There is a philosophical weight to this mystery that transcends the individual. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan have become something more than historical figures. They are residents of the liminal. They exist in the static between the confirmed and the unknown. As long as the plane remains missing, they are never truly dead. They are suspended in a state of perpetual potential. They are forever flying on the erratic fuel gauge, forever searching for the island, forever transmitting on a frequency that no one can quite lock onto. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Perhaps they serve a different function. They remind us that despite our satellites, our sonar, and our archives, the world is still vast, deep, and capable of keeping a secret. The water is deep, the signal is lost, and the horizon remains empty. This concludes the file on Amelia Earhart. The investigation remains open, but the transmission ends here.